The wind howled like a wounded beast against the rough-hewn timbers of the cabin, a relentless scream that had swallowed the world whole for 3 days. Thorne stood by the frosted window, his breath pluming in the chill air that managed to seep through the iron-strong logs of his sanctuary. He was a man carved from silence and hard labor, his face a map of jagged lines and old scars that told stories he never spoke aloud. The isolation of the high mountains was not a burden to him, but a blanket, a heavy wool coat he wore to keep the stinging memories of a civilization that had rejected him at bay. Outside, the whiteout was total, a blinding sheet of snow that erased the horizon and turned the towering pines into ghostly sentinels. He turned back to the hearth, where the fire snapped and hissed, the only living thing in this frozen purgatory aside from himself. But then a sound cut through the gale. Not the groan of a tree or the shriek of the wind, but a frantic, hollow thud against the heavy oak door. It was a sound so feeble, so desperate, that for a moment Thorne believed it was a trick of the mind, a phantom conjured by the altitude and the solitude. He moved with the deliberate grace of a predator, his hand instinctively brushing the cold steel of the revolver at his hip before gripping the iron latch. When he threw the door open, the storm punched him in the chest, a physical blow of ice and fury. He squinted against the stinging assault, looking down, and his heart hammered against his ribs. There, half buried in the drift that had piled against his threshold, lay 2 figures. They were huddled together in a tangled knot of limbs, covered in inadequate coats that had frozen stiff. Thorne did not hesitate. The instinct to preserve life was older and deeper than his cynicism. He dropped to his knees, the snow instantly soaking his trousers, and scooped them up. They were terrifyingly light, their bodies yielding and cold, like birds fallen from a winter nest. He dragged them inside, kicking the door shut against the howling intruder, and the sudden silence of the cabin felt deafening. As he laid them on the bear-hide rug before the roaring hearth, the firelight danced over their faces, revealing a truth that made him pause even in his urgency. They were identical. 2 women with features of porcelain and jet-black hair that spilled like ink across the fur, their faces mirror images of a fragile, terrifying beauty. Thorne moved with a frantic efficiency that belied his size, stripping away the frozen, sodden layers of their outer garments to get them close to the warmth. The fire was a roaring beast now, fed by the heavy logs he had chopped weeks ago, its heat radiating outward to battle the chill of death that clung to the women. He worked in silence, his large, callous hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for frostbite, his fingers grazing skin that felt like marble. They were barely breathing, their chests rising and falling in shallow, synchronized hitches that terrified him. He fetched thick wool blankets, piling them high, creating a cocoon of heat around them. He boiled water, the smell of steam and wet wool filling the small space, grounding him in the reality of the crisis. He sat back on his heels, watching them, his own breath steadying as the adrenaline began to ebb into a dull ache of vigilance. They were strangers, anomalies in this harsh, unforgiving landscape where only the hardest things survived. Yet here they were, twin flowers cast into the snow, miraculously alive. He found himself studying their faces, the curve of their lashes against pale cheeks, the identical arch of their brows. In the flickering orange light, they looked ethereal, spirits of the winter sent to test his resolve, or perhaps to haunt him. Hours bled into the night, the storm outside raging with undiminished fury while the cabin held its breath. Thorne did not sleep. He sat in his armchair, a sentinel in the shadows, watching for the slightest shift in their condition. It was well past midnight when the first movement came. The woman on the left stirred, a low moan escaping her lips, and her hand sought the hand of her sister, gripping it with a strength born of survival. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and disoriented, reflecting the flames. She saw Thorne sitting in the dark, a looming silhouette, and gasped, pulling the blanket higher. Her movement woke the other, and within seconds 2 pairs of identical, terrified eyes were fixed on him. Thorn leaned forward into the light, raising his hands slowly to show he held no weapon, his scarred face softened by the fire's glow. "You're safe," he said, his voice rusty from disuse, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "The storm can't touch you here." The first woman swallowed, her throat dry, her gaze darting around the sturdy walls, the stacked firewood, the kettle steaming on the hook. She looked at her sister, then back at him, her expression crumbling from fear into a profound, shattering relief. "No one gave us shelter," she whispered, the words trembling in the air like smoke. Her sister finished the thought, her voice a husky echo. "They shut their doors against the snow." The morning broke not with sunlight, but with a gray, diffused luminescence that signaled the storm had merely paused to catch its breath. Thorn was already awake, having dozed only fitfully in the chair, his body aching from the tension of the night. He stood by the cast-iron stove, the smell of frying bacon and strong coffee permeating the cabin, sense of life and normalcy that felt jarring against the backdrop of the previous night's near tragedy. The twins were awake, watching him from their nest of furs. They had sat up, wrapping the blankets tight around their shoulders, their long dark hair framing faces that were regaining the flush of life. Thorn turned, holding 2 tin mugs of coffee, the steam rising in twisting ribbons. He approached them slowly, offering the mugs with a respectful distance. "Drink," he commanded softly. "It will warm the blood." The sister on the right reached out first, her fingers brushing his calloused hand. The contact was electric, a sudden spark that made Thorn flinch inwardly, though his face remained impassive. "I am May," she said, her voice clearer now, possessed of a quiet dignity despite her ragged state. She nodded to her sister. "This is Lynn. We are indebted to you." Thorn nodded, retreating to the safety of the stove to plate the food. "I'm Thorn," he replied, his name feeling heavy and clumsy in the air. He wasn't used to introductions. The mountains didn't care for names. As they ate, he observed them covertly. They moved with a synchronized grace, passing the bread between them, sharing silent glances that communicated volumes without a single word spoken. It was a language of intimacy he had never known, a bond that seemed to defy the physical separation of their bodies. They were not just sisters. They were 2 halves of a whole, their souls stitched together. He felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar in his chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a profound awareness of his own hollow solitude. He had built this cabin to keep the world out, to protect himself from the judgment and the noise of men. But seeing them here, bringing light and softness into his gray world, he realized how cold his existence had truly been. Lynn looked up, catching his stare, and instead of looking away, she held his gaze. Her eyes were searching, intelligent, seeing past the scars on his cheek to the man beneath. "You live here alone?" she asked, not with pity, but with a curiosity that felt dangerously intimate. "I do," Thorn answered, his voice gruff. "It's safer that way." May lowered her cup, a sad smile touching her lips. "Safety is a lonely thing," she murmured, a truth that hung in the air long after the fire crackled in agreement. By the second day, the snow had piled halfway up the windows, sealing the cabin into a twilight world of firelight and shadows. The dynamic in the small space began to shift from savior and survivors to something more complex, a fragile domesticity forged by necessity. Thorn found himself acutely aware of their presence, the rustle of their movements, the soft cadence of their whispers in a language he didn't understand but found beautiful, like the sound of water over stones. He learned their story in fragments, delivered in the quiet hours of the afternoon while the wind battered the roof. They had come west looking for a father they had never known, a laborer on the railroads who had vanished into the vastness of the frontier. But the towns they passed through offered no kindness to women of their likeness. They were met with suspicion, lewd jeers, and closing doors. The stagecoach had abandoned them miles back when the axle broke, the driver caring more for his horses than his foreign passengers. They had walked until their legs failed, until the cold began to feel like sleep. As Lynn spoke, recounting the cruelty of the world outside, Thorne felt a familiar darkness coil in his gut. He knew that cruelty. He had seen it in the eyes of men who looked at his scars, the result of a fire he had survived as a boy, and deemed him a monster. He reached out, picking up a heavy iron poker to adjust the logs, his knuckles white. The world is full of men who are smaller than the land they stand on, Thorne said, his voice low and dangerous. They fear what they cannot break. May looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She reached out, her hand hovering over his forearm, sensing the tension in his muscles. "But you," she said softly, "you are like the mountain. You did not break." The comparison silenced him. He looked at her, then at Lynn, seeing the same expression of fierce admiration on both faces. It was disarming. For years he had been the scarred recluse, the beast of the high pass, to be seen as something strong, something noble, by these two women who had every reason to fear men, shook the foundations of his guarded heart. The intimacy of the cabin grew with the deepening snow. There was nowhere to go, no escape from the magnetic pull that seemed to be developing between the three of them. It wasn't a loud or chaotic passion, but a slow, rhythmic tide. Thorne would be mending a bridle, the leather creaking in his hands, and he would look up to find May watching him, her gaze lingering on his hands. Or he would be chopping kindling near the door, and Lynn would stand close, the heat of her body radiating toward him, her presence a silent comfort. They began to help him with small tasks, weaving themselves into the fabric of his life. They insisted on cooking, turning his simple rations of dried meat and beans into meals that tasted of care and effort. The cabin, once a place of stark survival, began to smell of life, of dried herbs they found in his pantry, of wood smoke, and the subtle floral scent of their skin. One evening, as the fire burned low, the atmosphere shifted into something palpable. Thorne was sitting on the floor, oiling his rifle, a task he usually performed with mechanical detachment. May and Lynn were sitting on the rug nearby, mending a tear in one of the blankets. May stopped her work, her eyes fixed on Thorne's profile. "You saved us," she said, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. "But you still look at the door as if you expect the storm to come inside." Thorne paused, his hand stilling on the stock of the gun. He looked at her, feeling exposed. "The storm always comes back, May," he said quietly. "It's the nature of things." Lynn moved then, shifting closer until she was kneeling just inches from him. She reached out and gently took the rifle from his hands, setting it aside on the floorboards. The gesture was bold, a disarming of his defenses that no one had ever dared. "Then let us be the shelter this time," Lynn whispered. Thorne looked from Lynn to May, seeing the same fierce, tender resolve in both their eyes. His heart, a fortress of iron and ice, felt the first hairline fracture, a terrifying and wonderful yielding to a warmth he had never thought he would deserve. The wind howled outside, a impotent rage against the walls, but inside, in the circle of firelight, the silence was heavy with a new, unspoken promise. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day, not with a whisper, but with a blinding, diamond-hard silence. The sun crested the jagged peaks of the Rockies, turning the valley into a bowl of crushed glass, the light so intense it forced the eyes to water. Thorne opened the heavy door, the wood groaning against the frost, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp enough to snap iron, filling his lungs with a sharp, painful clarity. Behind him, he heard the soft shuffle of footsteps. May and Lynn appeared, wrapped in the woolen blankets he had given them, their eyes widening as they took in the vast, glittering expanse. It was a world erased of color, reduced to the starkest blue of the sky and the absolute white of the ground. Thorne watched them, not the landscape. He saw the way the light caught the raven sheen of their hair, the way they leaned into each other for warmth, a single entity of survival against the backdrop of infinite cold. "It is beautiful," May whispered, her breath misting before her. "And terrifying." Thorne nodded, kicking a drift of snow off the boot scraper. "Beauty out here has teeth," he murmured. "It kills the careless." Lynn stepped forward, her boots crunching on the frozen crust, and looked at him. "And yet you stay," she challenged softly. "You choose the teeth over the towns." Thorne turned his scarred profile to the light, letting the sun illuminate the jagged map of his past. "The towns have teeth too," he replied, his voice rough. "They just smile before they bite." It was the most he had ever revealed about the wounds that weren't on his skin, a confession that hung in the frozen air between them. The days that followed the clearing of the storm were defined by a strange, suspended tension, as if the clock of the world had stopped ticking. The snow was too deep to traverse without snowshoes, which Thorne began to fashion from bent ash wood and rawhide, his hands moving with a rhythmic, hypnotic precision. May and Lynn sat nearby as he worked, the fire snapping in the hearth, their presence a constant, soothing weight in the room. They spoke of their journey, of the railroad camps where they had asked for a man named Chin, their father, only to be met with blank stares or cruel laughter. They described the hunger that had gnawed at them, not just for food, but for a place where they did not have to look over their shoulders. Thorne listened, the rawhide binding tight in his grip. He felt a rising tide of anger for these women he had known for less than a week, a protective fury that startled him. He realized then that he was stalling. He was making the snowshoes slowly, meticulously, adding unnecessary reinforcements because he knew that when they were finished, the twins would have the means to leave. The thought of the cabin returning to its previous silence, a silence that had once been his armor, now felt like a sentencing to a hollow grave. He looked up and caught Lynn watching his hands, her expression unreadable. "You are making them strong," she observed. "Strong enough to walk away," Thorne said, his voice flat. May looked up from the book she had found on his shelf. "Is that what you want?" she asked, the question direct, piercing through his defenses. Thorne didn't answer immediately. He looked at the fire, then at the two of them, seeing the life they brought to his gray existence. "What I want," he said hoarsely, "has never mattered much to the world." Night fell early in the valley, a curtain of indigo dropping over the peaks, bringing the temperature down with a physical weight. The cabin was a cocoon of warmth, the scent of pine resin and roasting venison filling the air. They ate dinner in a companionable silence, the kind that usually takes years to cultivate. After the plates were cleared, the atmosphere shifted. The unspoken question of their departure the next day hung heavy in the room. Thorne stood by the window, looking out at the moonlight on the snow, feeling the familiar ache of his solitude waiting to reclaim him. He felt a hand on his shoulder, light as a sparrow. He turned to find May standing there, with Lynn right beside her. In the dim light, their eyes were liquid dark, reflecting the turmoil he felt in his own chest. "The road will be clear tomorrow," Thorne said, the words tasting like ash. "You can make it to the pass by noon." Lynn took a step closer, closing the distance until he could feel the warmth radiating from her. "We have been looking for a ghost," she said quietly. "A father who left before we were born. We thought he was our destination." May moved to his other side, her hand resting gently on his arm over the thick wool of his shirt. "But we were wrong," May continued, her voice trembling slightly. "We weren't looking for a person. We were looking for this." She gestured to the room, to the fire, to him. Thorne's breath hitched. He looked at him, terrified by the hope that was blooming in his chest, a dangerous, fragile flower. "I am not a father," Thorne rasped, his voice breaking. "I am a scarred man with nothing but winter to offer." "You are the shelter," Lynn whispered, reaching up to touch the jagged scar on his cheek, her fingers cool and healing. "You opened the door when the world locked us out." The morning came with a cruel brilliance, the sun mocking Thorne's internal storm. The snowshoes lay finished by the door, silent accusations. Thorne moved through the cabin with mechanical stiffness, packing a saddlebag with dried meat, a map drawn on parchment, and a small flask of whiskey. He was preparing them for the world that wanted to devour them, doing his duty as a man of conscience, even as every fiber of his being screamed against it. He placed the bag on the table and turned to face them. They were dressed in their coats, standing by the hearth, looking at him with an intensity that made his knees weak. "The trail follows the creek," Thorne said, pointing to the map, his hand shaking slightly. "Keep the water on your left. You'll reach the settlement in 2 days." He refused to meet their eyes, afraid that if he did, his resolve would shatter like ice under a hammer. He was trying to be the hero, the selfless savior who releases the birds back into the sky, but he felt like the villain in his own story. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. Neither of them moved to take the bag. Neither of them moved toward the door. Thorne finally looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion and pain. "Why don't you go?" he asked, his voice cracking. "The weather holds. You have to go now." May stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a fierce, quiet determination. She reached out and took the map from the table, and with a slow, deliberate movement, she dropped it into the fire. The parchment curled and blackened, the ink of the escape route turning to smoke. "We are not lost any more," she said. Thorne stared at the burning map, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The finality of the gesture left him reeling. He looked at Lynn, who was unbuttoning her heavy coat, shedding the layers of departure. "You don't understand," Thorne pleaded, a desperation in his voice. "I am a man etched in shadow. People don't stay here. They survive here, and then they leave." Lynn walked over to him, her gaze steady and anchoring. She took his rough, calloused hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "Then let us change the story," she said. "We have spent our lives being 2 halves of a whole, wandering in a world that sees us as curiosities or burdens. We do not want to wander any more." May joined them, completing the circle, her hand covering theirs. The heat of their skin against his was a revelation, a tether to the earth that he had never known he needed. "We choose the winter," May said softly. "We choose the silence. And we choose you." Thorne fell to his knees, not in defeat, but in a surrender to a grace he had never imagined possible. He pressed his forehead against their joined hands, a sob shuddering through his massive frame. For the first time in 20 years, the cold that had lived in the marrow of his bones began to thaw. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling the snow around the sturdy timber walls, but inside there was no fear. The storm could rage all it wanted. They were the shelter, and they were home.